My name is Chuck Losh. I'm a solutions architect here at Trend Micro, and I have my partner here at AWS, Samir, who is also a solutions architect at AWS. And it looks like we've got people rolling in for today's webinar. So we appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend some time with us today. This is a tandem webinar we're putting on with AWS, one of our great partners, and Trend Micro. And we're going to talk today specifically about the S3 service. You can see here the topic of discussion is simple and scalable file storage security for Amazon Simple Storage Service. So say that three times fast. But great topics today. We're going to have AWS speak first. Samir's going to take us through AWS best practices when it comes to S3, integration services, best practices that AWS provides. And then we're going to segue into Trend Micro and how we can look at that shared responsibility model, right? As those files land in those buckets, looking at inspection and how we can work to protect those downstream workflows. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Samir. So go ahead and take it away, Samir.
Great, thanks, Chuck. My name is Samir. I'm a partner solutions architect at AWS. I focus on security partners, which means I get to work with folks like Trend Micro to help build new solutions, integrations, and products that help our customers be more secure on the cloud as they move their workloads over. So today, as Chuck mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about Amazon S3 and some of the security best practices around it, and some of the things that customers today are sort of using in terms of making sure that their data as it resides on S3 as well as it's being used by applications is being secured both in rest and in transit. So with that said, let's chat a little bit about when we talk about Amazon and S3 being a service, let's talk a little bit about how we delineate sort of the security responsibilities when you sort of have an object storage service, right? In general, AWS views security as a shared responsibility between us and our customers, which means AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud, and customers are responsible for security in the cloud. And what that really means is AWS is looking after the security of everything from the physical security of our data centers and the infrastructure that runs in it, up until the hypervisor layer and all of the underlying components that support it. Customers then are responsible for ensuring that they are running their application securely on top of this infrastructure, which means they are looking at securing their guest operating systems, patching, doing vulnerability management, ensuring data that resides on it or transits through it is secure, as well as making sure that you're giving access to these different resources based on a principle of least privilege. And this is where sort of partners like Trend Micro come in and sort of help our customers ensure they're securing their different applications and resources on AWS. So if you think about S3 and sort of how this pertains to the shared responsibility model, S3 itself is inherently built on some of these secure foundations like I talked about. But as customers put data in there, you want to make sure that you're giving the right permissions for either applications, users, or sort of AWS services itself, access to it, as well as understand sort of what is the data you're putting in it, whether you're thinking about segregating and classifying data based on PII information, or even understanding that, if these are things that are object stores and your application is using it, are there executables in that which could potentially manifest itself as malware or anything else that might exist in that bucket. So with that said, AWS gives customers a bunch of access controls that can simplify and also give you granular control over how objects are stored and accessed for your applications and users. And some of these access controls are sort of things like identity and access management, S3 access control lists, bucket policies, and access points. We'll go through a little bit of each of these today, but the fundamental building block of enabling access control for S3 starts off with what we call identity and access management. And identity and access management is based off of things like user policies, which is essentially a JSON document that describes the permissions a user has to do something on AWS. So the common way to look at it is what can this particular user do within an AWS environment. Um, it enables you to control access to all AWS services. So a standard administrative policy, for example, would just be a wildcard that allows you to sort of access all services. But then you can also sort of structure it out to become really granular, and we'll go through that. But in essence, when you start building out a user policy, it's by default secure in the sense that we do not enable any permissions by default. Customers are required to sort of add granular permissions on top of it to enable access for users that are going to use this policy. So once you have sort of the ability of a user to maybe even access S3 or do certain operations on S3 using IAM, the second sort of access layer, or the second sort of access policy you can put into sort of create that sort of defense in depth approach to how you enable access to resources is by enabling things like Amazon S3's bucket policies. So from a user perspective, the answer for the IAM user policy would be what can this user do? The S3 bucket policy really talks to who can access this S3 resource. So while the IAM user could potentially say that you have access to S3, an S3 bucket policy could limit the number of users that have access into objects that are written into the bucket. So how would you sort of distinguish how you would use each of these policies? If you want to centralize sort of the way you want to define who has access to what and which buckets, you can potentially do it through IAM. But if you want to keep access control to S3 only through S3, you could potentially use S3 bucket policies as well. You can also grant cross-account access to your S3 bucket without using IAM roles. So your S3 bucket policies can use sort of ARNs or Amazon resource names that are unique to sort of give you access into environments that don't necessarily belong to you either. The final bit of sort of consideration that customers need to make is buckets are made private by default. Uh, we enabled a public block public access by default on Amazon S3, which means at either an organizational level or within sort of each account, you're able to set by default all buckets to be private, and you can certainly turn on in certain use cases where it's applicable, buckets can be made public as well. So if we think about how IAM policies then need to be structured as you sort of go through the method of writing these out, you have 5 things you need to think about. The things that you need to think about are what is the effect that the policy is going to have? Who's the principal or the identity that's going to allow it? Um, the action that they can perform, the resource that they can access, as well as the conditions that they can access this under. So as you write your policy statements, you can sort of think about making this very granular. When you think about allowing or denying an action, you can make it structured in such a way that you can only allow specific API calls for the S3 for S3 resources, which means I can say that a particular IAM user has access into an S3 bucket with a particular prefix to only get objects from if they have a string that exists in this particular request. So you can get pretty granular in the way you structure your IAM policies and define those to users as well. Now, how would that sort of also how will that sort of translate into sort of an Amazon S3 bucket policy? It looks very similar. So you still have sort of the effect, principle, action, resource, and condition. But you are able to sort of then use those same sort of bucket policy, same sort of conditions in a bucket policy as well, and limit it based on the conditions and specific tag values that you're looking for. So you have these different ways that you can potentially apply access controls to both S3 buckets and objects within them, and how users are able to then analyze or users are able to access these resources. How does one then understand, given that you have these 5 different ways of limiting access, how do we actually evaluate if a particular resource would have access for a particular object? The way we analyze and process our access policies is by first uh, denying access as our default. Then we evaluate all of our applicable policies. So in the case of S3, we look at IAM policies, bucket policies, VPC endpoint policies, and object ACLs. And we evaluate them first for any explicit deny for the request being made, which would result in a final decision being a deny, irrespective of an allow statement afterwards. So an explicit deny always will result in a user not being able to access that particular resource if that condition didn't match. If there is an allow statement, and if it matches sort of all of the conditions that we were looking for, then we will have access to it. So we do take into account all of these policies and evaluate it at the same time. And based off of that is when we make the decision on whether we allow access or not. Now, there are customers who are extra sensitive to also give any sort of long-term access to resources, even with sort of these bucket ACLs and objects in place. One of the things that we've enabled and customers have been using for a while now is a concept called pre-signed URLs. You can create and generate a URL and provide sort of the credentials that you're using, and set an expiration time to generate a URL that will be valid only for the period of time you specify. These pre-signed URLs can be used to sort of get or sort of put objects into sort of the bucket then. It's like I mentioned, valid only till expiration time, but one word of caution for customers is that anyone with that URL can perform those actions. So you want to make sure that you are providing these pre-signed URLs to appropriate resources. Now, when we think then of sort of the different access policies, at which levels are then each of these access policies enforced, and where are their boundaries? If you think of sort of VPC endpoint policies, which are applied on S3 access points or S3 VPC endpoints, these sort of limit at sort of the network level access into sort of the S3 buckets based on user permissions defined on the endpoint policy. You can structure this out to also enable sort of boundaries at the organization level by enabling SCPs. So a good example of this would be no buckets within an organization should be made public, would be an SCP you can apply across all accounts. And finally, S3 block public access, which is similar, which is turned on by default, is by default setting all of these objects and S3 buckets to private. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what block public access does. Public access really is defined as any anonymous or overly permissive access that we provide into the bucket, and these are typically used by customers either to sort of host static sort of websites, but it can be used for other purposes as well. And your bucket policies would look something like this, where you're either allowing a put or get action into the bucket with principles and conditions that don't really have any boundaries necessarily. So Amazon S3 block public access then enables you to stop this sort of from happening using 4 different security settings, which are either applicable at the account level or individual buckets. And you can sort of use organization SCPs to make any changes to these settings as something that a user cannot change. So the 4 sort of things that we can sort of block is if you block all public access, you can stop any new buckets from being created and any new objects being created with public access, or you can sort of change it to block public access granted through any ACLs or through new bucket policies, and also for any cross account access as well, because sometimes while it's not publicly accessible, you might have other resources either as another sort of group sort of accessing it or another partner sort of accessing this data, which also can be blocked. So once you have your data and you've defined your access controls, it's also pertinent that customers decide how they want to encrypt that data once it's on there. AWS has multiple ways that we enable sort of encryption for data that both persists in AWS and in S3, as well as how you access that data through our API endpoints. So when we talk about encryption in transit, all our API calls and API endpoints are encrypted using TLS. So customers don't have to worry about sort of exposing any of those objects and sort of calls to us or anyone else. And once you have objects on S3, because we have key management service tightly integrated with Amazon S3, you can choose to either use sort of Amazon generated keys to encrypt the data, or you can generate your own keys provided and use customer managed keys to encrypt that data as well. You can also use sort of a client side AWS encryption SDK to sort of encrypt the data as well. Uh, Now that customers have sort of defined both encryption and sort of access controls, you now want to make sure that you're monitoring for who's accessing this information and how they're accessing it. And that sort of changes the discussion into how do we monitor for changes within an S3 environment and for information on what might exist in those buckets as well. So we talked a little bit about how you can use bucket access control in S3, but with things like AWS config rules, you can define AWS config checks to continuously monitor and alert on things like S3 bucket policies that might allow for public read or public write. And this can trigger sort of CloudWatch event sort of rules that can either trigger let's say a Lambda to go change the bucket permissions, or even send out an alert to an administrator that this is a potential breach of security controls that are in place for the organization. Amazon Macy is another tool which you can use to identify PII information that might be stored in objects within the bucket. And this might help you sort of classify data as it comes in to understand, are applications using the right buckets for segregating data to maintain compliance for your application as well. In addition to some of these, we also have sort of object encryption status through things like Amazon S3 inventory, but you also have S3 server access logs, which can give you insight into every sort of data plane activity as well, that enables you to do things like, if you put an object into an S3 bucket, you can use that event to do certain things, as well as use AWS CloudTrail to sort of capture any sort of API calls made against S3 as a service. So if you're doing sort of a list buckets within an account, those would be things you would capture within CloudTrail. Now, this is all fantastic in the sense that you have granular controls, you have the ability to monitor, you have these different things, but can we make it sort of simpler to understand how a bucket is exposed, whether that's across accounts or giving access giving access to the world. So in this case, AWS launched something called Access Analyzer for S3, and Access Analyzer has the capability to generate findings that give you granular information on which objects have cross account or public access under which conditions, and enables you to sort of update those policies to protect those resources. So the way that S3 Analyzer works is it has a concept called a boundary, which is typically the AWS account that we're talking about. And it looks at the resource policies for everything from IAM roles to S3 buckets, Lambda functions, SQSQs, and KMS keys. But in this case, it looks at the bucket policies, for example, and uses sort of automated reasoning to understand whether a potential condition would expose objects within that bucket to either a role or a resource outside of the account or to the public. So this automated reasoning then allows you to generate a finding to give you the answer around who has access to what, and the conditions for it. So for customers that are looking to, quickly figure out, hey, I have a bunch of new S3 objects. I don't know who has access to these. S3 Access Analyzer is a great way of going and finding that out. So with that said, I'm going to sort of transition this over to Chuck, and have him sort of walk through, once you have all of this data, how do you sort of ensure the integrity sort of the data, and how applications use it, and sort of make sure that the entire workflow then is secure when you're using things that are stored in buckets. So that's Chuck, take it away.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Samir. And I'm going to go ahead and get screen sharing in order here. And yeah, the discussion has been great. With AWS starting off. I mean, Samir, I was definitely feverishly writing down a lot of the things you mentioned, especially getting into the Access Analyzer service. It just, the access policy processing, going through that on all the different ways that you can protect those buckets regarding access control lists and security monitoring, and even pairing that with native AWS services. It's an awesome presentation. So to segue into the discussion from Trend Micro, how Samir started off in today's discussion was he's talking about the shared responsibility model, right? And kind of in the segue portion. And by the way, during our presentation today, feel free to please use the chat. We have moderators standing by that can take your questions. So at the end, if you have questions in that AWS respect that Samir can answer while he's here, and then myself from a Trend Micro perspective. So we encourage you to do that. Just want to remind y'all. But what we're looking at from Trend Micro is, data security, those files and objects that are getting pushed into those buckets in an S3. And how, are those files being scanned for malicious payloads, and how can that, affect your downstream workloads? That's the idea that we're looking at where we come in that shared responsibility model. Customers ultimately responsible for what they're putting in those buckets from an object standpoint. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here real quick is, actually don't have the polling available to me, so that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and skip the polling on the bar here, but I do have a poll. Usually I start out with customers and ask on how, are you using malware scanning today, right? Whether that's in a, third capacity standpoint or third party standpoint, or maybe this is something you haven't thought of before, or maybe the folks on the phone, I'm in that development mindset. And I'm just told which buckets are being provisioned for me, and then I'm connecting my downstream application to that. So I don't really know what's going on upstream, if those are being scanned or not for malicious content. I'm kind of the downstream receiver with the application development. So what we're trying to tell you here is you're not alone. We're going to take a quick look at an example case study on how we've helped a customer with that situation. So let's take a look. We're going to leave names aside here, but we'll call them Acme Industries. And just a little bit of background on this customer when we work with them is, in the past year, with everything going on in the world, is they lifted and shifted their on-premise application. They were doing file uploads using secure FTP, fleet of servers that were processing those files that come in, and then landing them in their downstream applications, and then email links would go out to user endpoints inside their organization to people's mailboxes to go, hey, you just received a file, you need to go ahead and process this. Different types of files, kind of all over, like you can imagine, invoices being on, PDF documents and other text file documents and spreadsheets, things like that, and then also media files as well, depending on where they were in their organization. So they lifted and shifted this application to the cloud. They wanted to go cloud native. Basically, for the S3 service right out of the gate, being able to not having to provision on-prem infrastructure to manage, file management, right? To be able to use S3 for that uploading portion. So they've got their public application and public users, their suppliers, their customers that are uploading files to an S3 bucket, depending on where that's coming from in that forward-facing public application. Downstream application receives the S3 bucket, file from S3 bucket, and then produces an email link that was going through the internal email application to an user endpoint. And they contacted us, you can see here on the far right with the Trend Micro Shield, as from time to time this happened where the user would actually be logging into the mail application. They would say, hey, you've received a file that you need to process today. They click the link, which is downloading from the S3 bucket, and their endpoint application protection software would kick off, from Trend Micro to say, hey, this is malicious. They do the right thing. They would contact their IT department and say, hey, I clicked on a link, and you can imagine the IT department like, whoa, we tell you not to do that. Don't click on links. Where did this come from? Doing their due diligence. Hey, it came from our internal web application. I use this all the time. So that got the IT help desk department involved to chase that upstream, right, to that downstream application. They knew which bucket that was being subscribed to, and they were finding that malicious files were ending up on those buckets from their suppliers and vendors, by accident. They're just uploading in that and it's going downstream. Luckily, they had the user endpoint software on there, right, is that last line of defense. So it was caught, but you want to catch that upstream. So that's where they approached us because they're an existing customer. So what we want to do as far as learning from this, like what do we learn from this exercise with this customer? Well, what like Samir had said, to tie in some of his discussion, is we know that buckets are natively secure, right? He mentioned those best practices, public ACLs, a lot of those things are turned in the best practice configuration by default. That a lot of times what we see at Trend Micro is that human error comes that element, right? The human error, I go in, I have the access, I have the means, I create a misconfiguration, and that tends to be the culprit of bucket misuse. And then fact number two is we know in this particular engagement working with his customers, and Samir touched on this, public buckets, there's some relevancy there and they may be needed. Maybe there's a static website they need hosted, or in this case, this needs to be publicly facing for customers to interact with it. And then fact three, in building this relationship with his customers, yeah, the value of S3 is, they're worrying less about capacity constraints, right? They're able to provision buckets to hook up to their downstream applications, freeing them up from that on-prem infrastructure, those quandary of decisions of buying new servers and disks every year, that now they got that everything running in S3. They're worried less about capacity, but they weren't thinking about potential malware getting into that bucket. So that's the three facts in this case study that we worked with this customer, which we had three problems to attack to provide them a solution, right? We know that properly configured buckets is secure, but problem number one is that malware is getting downstream. We want to make sure that those uploads don't contain any malware that can cause issues to those downstream subscribed applications. Two, this is definitely relevant to myself when I work with customers, is how do we introduce those scanning capabilities without impacting application performance? Work on the endpoint side of business or working on servers, like, okay, let me install that agent. First thing usually customers ask is go, hey, well, how's this going to impact performance? Or do I need to change my system requirements? Or hey, do you have customizable options that I can customize, the scanning agent to make sure that I don't have any implications as far as performance? And then problem number three is this deployment. Last thing we want to do is say, hey, you have to deploy a fleet of servers, install agents on here, shuttle data back and forth, maybe copying data from the S3 buckets to a fleet of servers or shared file system and put it back and all that kind of stuff. And you've got infrastructure, you've got agents you may need to maintain, patch and update, and even servers. We want to make sure this is a cloud native deployment, right? That's efficient, that's flexible, and using cloud native services in the customer's account so they can get immediate impact, because they may be provisioning tens of buckets a day or hundreds of buckets a day or a week, etc. And we don't want that to maybe data sovereignty. We don't want those files to leave the environment. We want everything done in that customer's account for compliance there, for example. So those are 3 problems that we worked on with this customer. And the solution, as you can see here, is Trend Micro Cloud One File Storage Security. This is one component of our 6 services that make up Cloud One for cloud builders that we published out last year. So if you look at this infographic, this is right off, everything I'm showing you today is right off of our help center. You can see this is like, think back in school, this is a transparency that goes right over that use case that we just talked about, right? It's kind of, you could actually put this right over as a transparency that file is being uploaded, and then the S3 bucket to being scanned. We talk about deployment options. Okay, this is deployed via CloudFormation. For the folks that are out there doing infrastructure as code or using CloudFormation, this makes sense to them because they can easily deploy and scale on the amount of buckets that they're scanning. And we're deploying cloud native services to get this done. So that S3 bucket that we're now monitoring with what's called a storage stack, and we'll get into that in a little bit, is using Lambda functions, right? It's using serverless functions to monitor and listen for files when they land and they're at rest, and then invoke our security scanner through what's called a scanner stack through CloudFormation, and saying, hey, we're publishing this to an SQS queue. This is a file that came in. You need to take a look at this, and invokes the scanner. And this is all done on a customer's account. Nothing leaves the account, because Samir, to touch on one of his best practice topics, he talked about using pre-signed URLs. That's what we're doing here, is we're invoking our scanner and checking that pre-signed URL, looking at the hash value of that file as it comes in, and doing that intelligent scan with our Trend Micro Global Smart Protection Network, scanning the file and posting that back to an SNS topic, right? And that's what you can see here in that post-scan section here. By default, we post the scan results back to that file. We tag it with using AWS native tags saying this file was scanned on this date and time. This was malicious and it was scanned successfully. And you can, a customer, talk about flexibility, is they can optionally, from our GitHub repository, deploy post-scan actions or plugins. And these are Lambda functions where they can say, all right, if this file is deemed malicious or quarantinable, let's go ahead and throw that to a bit bucket, throw that to a quarantine bucket, so that file is outside of that downstream workflow. If the file is clean, right, there's nothing wrong with it, let's go ahead and throw that in the clean bucket. Now your downstream workflow is connecting to that clean or sanitized vetted bucket, right? You're making sure that these files are being scanned in line in your application processing, and making sure that that downstream workflow, like we saw in the use case, isn't happening. It's not making it to that user endpoint. So a really cool technology. You talk about problem number 3, when you talk about scalability, right? In our problems we were talking about with this customer in the use case. As you see there in the upper left, we've got 3 application teams here, right? So they've got an application running in an environment. This is tied to a landing bucket, for example. You can deploy a storage stack for each bucket that you deploy. And you can even do this programmatically too. So automation is key here. Is that as these applications are built, the buckets are created, you can have a storage stack to listen for that bucket as files are landed there, and then push that upstream to a scanner stack. So just to paint a picture for you, as you can see from the diagram, that it's a one-to-one relationship, storage stack to bucket, and then one scanner stack can scan up to 50 buckets at one time. It's a 50-to-1 relationship there. So you have scalable options to scale out based on demand. And then when we talk about problem number 2 about performance, right, kind of rolling back here a little bit, with customers that say, hey, you know what, I may have tens of files coming in at a given time, or maybe up to 1,000 files being uploaded at a given time. You can see here on that chart here on the right that I'm pointing on, this is right out of our help center. So customers can go ahead and adjust inside the scanner stack. There is a Lambda function that's doing the scanning, and adjust the concurrency value there. So if you adjust, this is based on customer feedback and our internal development teams, you can adjust the concurrency. If this is your expectation based on your usage, adjust the concurrency of the Lambda function, and this is what you should expect is your total scan time in a number of seconds, right? And this is documented right on our performance and scaling section as customers onboard this. Third thing I'm going to talk about is deployment options. You can easily, I'm a UI person myself, so you can deploy stacks. You get a recipe, you get a ticket saying, hey, this bucket's been created. I can go right into our Cloud One console and deploy associated scanner stacks and storage stacks, or combination of both. Or what you can do is invoke our APIs. So if you are doing this programmatically, maybe using a CloudFormation template, somebody upstream is provisioning buckets for the application, and they say, hey, you know, this has been kicked off, you can go ahead and invoke our API and pass in those parameters, right? The newly bucket that was created, and go ahead and automatically provision a storage stack to protect those buckets. So automation is key here as well. So one thing I want to talk about, you know, Samir had brought it up when you talk about misconfigurations, and I brought up in my talk as well, is a lot of times what we've seen in working with customers is a lot of times where there's bucket misuse, there's been a misconfiguration. So as I talked about before, file storage security is just one piece of the puzzle of Cloud One, right? So we do have a product called Cloud One Conformity, which you're trying to establish that area of cloud security posture management, center of cloud excellence or governance. This can dynamically hook into your AWS account and look for, like in real time, like if Chuck has the means and I go ahead and, you know, programmatically, you know, build a bucket and I do something wrong and do some ACL blunders or something like that, we can alert you in real time. And then we also can provide auto remediation tactics via Lambda. And if you don't want to do the auto remediation, based on that real-time detection, you can see here on the right, this is our knowledge base, which is built into the product. So on that detection, we take you right into our knowledge base. Like you click here on the detection, and right here shows the remediation steps via the AWS console or AWS CLI. So I wanted to just feature that. This is like things to think about. These are other things that you can explore in the Cloud One portfolio. So let's go ahead and take a quick look here. Sharing my screen, I'm gonna go ahead and pull up a demo video of file storage security in action. So what you're seeing here, I'm gonna go ahead and hit the play button. I'm just gonna go ahead and talk over this. I had done this ahead of time. This is where we're deploying that all-in-one stack I was talking about. So step one, you can obviously do this programmatically, but I'm showing you through the console. You can sign into your AWS account. Step two is you're gonna load in our CloudFormation template. And when you hit that launch stack button, since I'm signed in here, we can see that folks that are familiar with CloudFormation on the phone, this is what you're gonna see. You're gonna go ahead and name that stack appropriately, and then the parameters are the only thing you're gonna change. You're gonna go ahead and put in the S3 bucket that you want to be able to scan and be monitored. And then this is, in addition, if you're doing encryption, like for best practice, like Samir was saying, if you're using KMS, SSA, you can go ahead and put in that key in there for that encryption, decryption process there. So those are the only things you need to fill out to get going. Like I said, the idea of this is simple to get easily deploy a CloudFormation stack, and on average 5 to 10 minutes for this to deploy. But you go ahead and accept the EULA there information in AWS and hit create stack. Now I went ahead and did this ahead of time, so we're just going to take a look at CloudFormation as the stack has been deployed. So that's step one, is deploy the stack. We go into CloudFormation here, and we take a look at the stacks as they've been built, and we can see there. Because I ran the all-in-one stack, I've got a storage stack and scanner stack created dynamically there, right? We want to click these stacks, and we need two pieces of information out of here under the output section. We just need the associated management roles, the ARNs, for the SNS topics for both the scanner stack and the storage stack, and we paste those appropriately in here. And what that's doing is it's creating that handshake behind the scenes between our Cloud One connection and your deployment inside the customer's AWS account. It's going to assume those roles for the Cloud One file storage scanner to work. Once you do that, you can see here in the console that I've got my scanner stack and associated the storage stack on the right there associated, and that bucket is now protected. It's doing its default scan action or post scan action of tagging the file, right? Tagging the file of, is this malicious or not, date time stamping. What we encourage customers to do, and in the documentation, like the get starting guide, is click this post scan action area. And you can see here, like, hey, after that file's been scanned, we're going to tag the file. But we invite our customers, and we provide this as a service to them to go out to our public GitHub repository, and we produce those post-scan actions I was telling you about. That remember I showed you in the architectural diagram, quarantine here, clean here. You can go right out here and deploy these Lambda functions to go ahead and add that additional post-scan action. We recommend this as a best practice here. So I think I talked a little bit ahead, but we'll see here in just a second, probably right on cue. I'll click the link. I don't want to go ahead and fast forward too much here. I apologize for the delay. There we go, I'll move it again. So there we go, right on cue there. So you can see we're going right out to the GitHub repository here, and it's all documented for your customers or yourself if you want to try this out yourself. You go to the post-scan actions, we've got email, Slack notifications, and then the promotion quarantine post-scan action as well. We see customers actually deploy all three, which is great, right? Having that notification, but also the data mover element, right? So you can see in here where you're the step-by-step instructions to deploy the Lambda, in the customer's account, and then subscribe that Lambda to that SNS topic. Remember that scanner stack posts back its results to an SNS topic. So all you gotta do is stitch those two together with the Lambda and the topic, and then you have that action take place. So let's go ahead and see that real quick in action. I'm gonna go into S3, and this is a file storage security landing bucket that I have in my account. So remember on that architectural diagram, somebody's uploading, or we've got that front end application that's being used by customers to upload. So that's I call it almost the sacrificial bucket now. That's that landing bucket. And in Cloud Shell, you can see me here going out and running a wget and going out to ICAR. We even tell our customers to go out, that's in our step-by-step guide. This is how you can test to make sure that the file storage security scan engine is working. And folks that are new to anti-malware technology, this is a site you're probably gonna wanna remember or bookmark. It's in our docs, but you go out to the ICAR website and you can download what's called an anti-malware test file. That way you're not testing, we definitely advise don't use real malware. You can go and test with our test pattern, or sorry, ICAR's test pattern file, and there's different options or even zip packages. So you can see me doing that there with a wget. And then what I'm doing is running an AWS CLI command, and I'm saying, I wanna go ahead and do a put command or a copy command to my landing bucket to test that my function listens, fires, and takes an evaluation of that. So that's what we're doing here. I'm going ahead and uploading to the landing bucket. Let's take a look, and I'll go to my landing bucket, and we see that ICAR file has just landed, right? So what we're doing right now is waiting for that Lambda function to fire, right? That Lambda function is gonna fire. It's gonna say, hey, there's a new file. I'm gonna pass that on to my scanner stack, like that pre-signed URL. It's gonna take a look, run the scan, and then post back to that SNS topic. So once that happens, you can see it's left the building, right? It's gone out of the landing bucket. So let's go ahead and take a look here on my additional buckets in my Amazon S3 account where it went, right? And I have my quarantine bucket right here in my promotion bucket. You see me highlighting those. So let's check to see which bucket it ended up in. So let's go to quarantine first, because that's where it should go on the decision tree. And this is not help guide for customers. The ICAR file is there. So, okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the ICAR file and look at that AWS tagging, right? That we tag each file that we scan. If we scroll down and go to the tagging section, we can see here we've got that scan date, that date timestamp, the result that the file was malicious, and that the file was scanned successfully. So cool, everything worked there. So the next thing we want to do real quick is go ahead and test the reverse of that, right? We want to go ahead and do a clean file real quick. And if we go into the Cloud Shell environment, up top again, you'll see me do that, where I'm going to go ahead and do a test text file. See if I go back over to, there we go, back over, there we go, Chuck. There we go to the Cloud Shell again. I'm doing a touch command in Linux. So just, hey, let me create a blank test file, test.txt. We know it's there now. This obviously is a brand new file, should not have anything malicious. Let's go ahead and push that back to that same landing bucket. And instead of doing the ICAR file, we're going to do the test text file. And let's test to make sure that everything works accordingly, right? So we go ahead and do that. It should take 1 second. Once I hit the return key here, that is now uploaded. We go to our S3 configuration here in Amazon S3. We go down and let's go ahead and check the landing bucket again. We know that the file got pushed. Let's go ahead and just refresh a couple times like I'm doing here for that Lambda function to fire. Once the file leaves the building here, we'll go ahead and we're going to go ahead and check the quarantine bucket first. We want to make sure that that logic works. It just doesn't end up, we want to test that function, right? So we're going to go in the quarantine bucket. The ICAR file is still there, so it's not there. Let's go ahead and check our clean sanitized bucket and check if it's there, right? So that's our promotion bucket, and it is. So now you can have that downstream application subscribe to that vetted promotion bucket. Those files that land in there are clean. They've been checked, right? So that makes to make sure that your downstream application, that doesn't happen in the future. So what you saw there is that demonstration of the product. Hope that was informative. Just again, to raise that point, this is part of our total solutions for cloud builders. So what you saw today is file storage security over here in the upper right for S3, right? You understand that now, how it works, what its use case is. We talked a little bit about conformity when you're trying to establish that area of cloud governance and excellence. We can look for misconfigurations, not just about S3, but other services in AWS as well, but focused on S3 today and kind of going around the bases here. If you're looking at VPC, inline traffic inspection, that where we can help you with network security. If you're looking to protect those EC2 instances on a single agent, 7 different modules, including anti-malware, that's workload security. If you're starting to do cloud native development in the container space, like using EKS, Fargate, for example, or even the container registry, from soup to nuts, we can protect your CI/CD pipeline, looking for as those container images are built, scan your container registry, and also provide admission control services to make sure that those deployment manifests that you're deploying to Kubernetes are meeting policy, meeting spec, right? And then lastly, with application security, if you're looking to protect those Lambda functions, those serverless functions and those public APIs, that we can help you with application security. This is runtime level security. And also if those applications are hosted in containers, you can provide runtime level security there to make up the whole makeup of Cloud One for cloud builders when it comes in respect to AWS services there. So if, like I said, if it's something that you're interested in, you're feeling adventurous, hey, Chuck, I want to try this out, you can go out to our, if you remember anything today from my discussion, go to trendmicro.cloudone.com. You can sign up for a free trial for 30 days. In that 30-day period, you not only get access to file storage security, but all 6 services. So you don't have to go like, oh, okay, it's 30 days up. I don't have access to file storage security. I got to go put a new ticket in or a new request. You have access to all 6 services. So today you could go out and deploy FSS in a matter of minutes, try it out, talk amongst your friends. And maybe if you're interested in cloud governance or container security, you can try those services out all during your 30-day period. So I wanted to thank Samir, first of all, for that lovely presentation to start things off. And I learned a lot, and definitely I hope that you enjoyed my presentation as well. Took some takeaways there, but I know we have moderators standing by, and I invited folks to go ahead and submit questions. So we'll go ahead and open up for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chuck. We do have a few questions. So the first one is right in the chat. And the question is, do you have to deploy the service per S3 bucket rather than having one that can watch all S3 tied to your account?
Yeah, so you have to tie the storage stack is per bucket. So it's a one-to-one relationship per bucket for the storage stack. The scanner stack, you can have up to 50 buckets protected at one time. To answer that one.
Okay, great. We have one for Samir. Can I restrict access to specific AWS services for some of my S3 buckets?
Yeah, so the bucket policies do definitely allow you to sort of even set AWS service as a principal for access. So let's assume a good example is when you have sort of CloudFormation templates stored in S3 buckets that you want to pull from. Typically, you would want to give CloudFormation access into that bucket. So absolutely, you do have the ability to have bucket policies to define which AWS services have access into the bucket.
Awesome. Thanks, Samir. We've got another one for Chuck. The question is, can we see the CloudFormation templates that are being deployed for customers to review?
Yes, absolutely you can. That gets asked a lot. Just when you have, SecOps personnel looking over the solution is right on that GitHub page where you can deploy the post-scan actions. You actually can look at the CloudFormation templates that we are deploying as well. So you have that for your perusal. Mm-hmm. Great question.
Great. And we have another one for Chuck. You mentioned application security. And that it can protect Lambda functions. So how exactly does it work that it protects Lambda functions?
Yeah, no, great question. We get asked that a lot. So it is providing runtime level security to your Lambda functions and exposed APIs like an API gateway, for example. And it uses the technology in Lambda called layers, where you can add layers to your function. So it adds a layer or a runtime environment, custom runtime environment that you can pull from Trend Micro. And to kind of paint a picture, it creates a secure wrapper around your function. So when that function is fired or warmed up and called, our wrapper takes a look at that request. So certain things like, a remote command execution attempt, for example, or maybe even at the application layer, you can inspect file uploads as they hit that Lambda function, and you can inspect that as well. So just kind of give you a couple examples. But the things that it can help you with is think OWASP top 10 type vulnerabilities for web application development. Those are the things that we're looking at when that Lambda function is fired, and we provide that runtime level protection using a Lambda layer.
Awesome, thanks. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the QA box. I think I got the ones from the chat. I've got another one for Samir. How can one track object activity within S3? CloudTrail gives me insight into API calls, but a customer wants to know about activity on the data path.
Yep. So I think that this one is also one of those questions we get often asked. So the object access logs are one that you want to keep a track of. So in terms of events that pertain to whether you're reading, writing, or putting objects into it, you want to make sure you have object access logs turned on and you're able to audit them to track that activity as well.
Awesome. And I have one more, and it's for Chuck, I think. It's around, is there documentation that I can look at to get started with this service?
Yes, absolutely. So all of our Trend Micro solutions are fully documented on the Cloud One site. When you actually sign into your Cloud One account, you can actually access our support. You go to the upper right, you go to the support documentation section, and you can access the docs for all 6 services. And they're really great. Like if you're working with a customer or you're trying this out for yourself, there's step-by-step. What you saw today in the demonstration, you can certainly try yourself or even send that to your customer to get going, especially like with file storage security like we talked about today.
Awesome. And so that's it for today. I think I covered all of our questions, and we have some wonderful trend reps who are in the session as well. And they'd love to remind you that there are lots of folks available to help you out. So if you have any questions or you're interested in any of the Cloud One services, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Chuck. It was very interesting. Love to see security services for such a popular AWS service as well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.